Well, I tried to do great. So I'm going to turn to Athens for the most part. And I want to thank Jeff Nelson and the other organizers for the chance to be part of this really terrific conference. Burke, Kirk, and Scruton are all great heroes of mine. Fortunately, I never got a chance to meet Russell Kirk, but I did get to know Roger Scruton pretty well. And, they were marvelous, great men. They're part of what I would describe as a sort of conservative phenomenological tradition. We've already talked about this. In fact, what I'm going to say is, in many ways, building on the remarks of James Matthew Wilson yesterday. And I think that and we should also include in that phenomenological tradition Irving Babbitt and Paul Elmer Moore as well. And in each case, they did a great job, I think, of understanding how human being appears to us in our experience. But and here I agree with James Matthew Wilson. I think this phenomenological perspective has to be balanced and supplemented with a metaphysics and with a philosophy of nature, a natural philosophy. And here I think I'm in agreement with some other great Anglo-American conservatives, C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, who talks about the need for a regenerate science, which I think is what I'm going to argue for, and then Richard Weaver and ideas have consequences. So I'm going to talk about that a bit. I'm going to give you the structure of the talk. It's going to start out with the sort of typical conservative Jeremiad about how everything's going to hell, and it has been for a long time. Western civilization didn't exist, has already died before I was born, that sort of thing. But then I'm going to turn midway, and it's going to end on a much more hopeful note. In fact, I think that the tide is turning, and that conservatives may actually find ourselves riding the wave in another generation or two, which will be a really new experience for a lot of us, for sure, if that actually happens. And then I know the title says natural theology, and I will get to natural theology, I think, if I have time. But I'm going to work my way around to it in a somewhat circuitous way. So hold your breath, and hopefully I'll get there eventually. So where did things go wrong? Clearly in the late Middle Ages, but things go decisively wrong with the Protestant Reformation. Right? So I realize to say that in Grand Rapids is a somewhat imprudent thing, and I should probably be burned in effigy at the very least for what I'm going to say, but I will say it. And actually, I'm saying this as someone who has spent 5/7 of his life as a Protestant, so I have some personal experience here. What Reformation did was inject two great errors into the West: an antipathy to medieval scholasticism, in particular to the Aristotelian tradition, and a kind of radical intellectual individualism in opposition to dogma and tradition. Now it's possible to be a Protestant and still be conservative, but one has to eschew these two errors. Now, there was actually, after the Reformation, a period of very dynamic Protestant scholasticism in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And unfortunately, it died out with the rise of pietism, but it certainly could be revived. And secondly, I think to be a conservative and a Protestant, you have to give up, or at least radically circumscribe the sola scriptura sort of model. So we have to read the scriptures in the church and with the church, not outside the church and independently of the church, in my view. So these two great Protestant errors are not uniformly present in the Protestant church. They're also not limited to Protestant denominations. Much of American Catholicism and Judaism have been thoroughly Protestantized in the last 100 years or so. Reformed Judaism, I think, through in Lutheran Germany when it was founded, and more so even in America. Catholicism through the Americanist heresies of the early 20th centuries, and then Vatican II, unfortunately, exacerbated that in many ways. So I think as we look forward, it's going to be religious traditions that have been historically marginal in America that will be the seedbed for the revival of conservatism, if I'm right. Traditional Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Orthodox Judaism, Anglo-Catholicism, perhaps, and even some non-Western traditions like Sikhism and certain versions of the Indian tradition, perhaps. So American evangelicalism, unfortunately, has really been overwhelmed by these two errors. The marriage of convenience between evangelicals and conservatives in the 70s and 80s was inherently unstable, and I think it's largely disappeared. Millennial and Gen Z evangelicals in America are largely a lost cause, except as possible Catholic and Orthodox converts. In fact, evangelicalism is on the path to self-destruction, repeating the mistakes of mainline Protestants of the 50s and 60s. Trinitarian and Christological heresies are metastasizing at an alarming rate. Young evangelicals are embracing all the shibboleths of progressivism and Marxism because, I think, evangelicalism lacks an understanding of the nature of tradition. So what have been the fruits of the Reformation? Why do I say that's where things go bad? Well, the main fruit was the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Wasn't that a good thing? Capital G, capital T? Well, it wasn't entirely a bad thing. I have to admit, I like penicillin and air conditioning, because of the Texan in particular. But the so-called scientific revolution was mostly a very bad thing. As C.S. Lewis puts it in The Abolition of Man, modern science was born at an inauspicious hour and in an unhealthy neighborhood. Scholars have demonstrated, in fact, that the idea of science, the rise of science, predated the so-called revolution by a long period, beginning at least in the 12th century. And technological improvements go back even further into the so-called Dark Ages, if you look at the work of Rodney Stark. So I think, actually, I would have had penicillin and air conditioning even without the scientific revolution. But what this revolution actually gave us, the actual revolution, was a revolt against Aristotle, and therefore the spreading and the deepening of the other Protestant error, this individualism. All backward-looking thought is now condemned as retarding the progress of science, with a capital P and a capital S. And the hierarchy of church and state have been replaced by a new hierarchy of scientific credentials, a magisterium of fact, as Stephen Jay Gould called it. So modern science, since the scientific revolution, is predicated on three metaphysical errors: the rejection of teleology, or final causation in nature, the replacement of essences and causal powers with abstract laws of nature, and the privileging of the microscopic over the macroscopic. So according to modern science, reality is nothing but the blind motion of particles in space, governed by inexorable laws of motion. These three metaphysical errors have great political and social consequences, all of them bad. So if these errors are going to be corrected, which I think they will be, they will have good social and cultural consequences. So the lack of teleology means an end to natural law ethics and to political theory. Natural laws developed by Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, and Aquinas is predicated on the idea that human beings have a natural end, so-called eudaimonia, felicity or happiness. And all political and legal systems can be evaluated rationally in terms of the degree to which they protect and encourage this natural end. This is the ultimate basis for the idea of human or natural rights, the right to a political order that protects the pursuit of happiness by individuals and by churches and other communities. So when David Hume says that there's no reason to think that wiggling my finger is not as important as the survival of the whole universe, so it all just depends on particular desires you have, he was really fundamentally undermining this idea of eudaimonia and therefore natural rights as well. Now, in addition, if we replace essences and causal powers with laws of nature, and we privilege the microscopic over the macroscopic, this means the end of real human agency and free will. There's no fundamental distinction between human beings and their non-rational environment. Both are simply forces to be manipulated for whatever ends we choose. There's no such thing as personal responsibility. Everything is the result of forces, including social forces, which are themselves the result of the motions of particles that make up the world. Now, in addition, if we privilege the microscopic over the macroscopic, we must treat human beings as machines, operating autonomously and independently of their social and historical context. We can no longer treat membership in a larger whole, such as family, local community, or nation, as having any ontological significance. The wholes in which we believe, to which we belong, extending outward in space and time, cannot, on this view, transform us deeply, any more than they can transform the nature of a vacuum cleaner or a thermostat, let's say. Now, there's no denying that there was some advantage gained from the focusing so single-mindedly on the microscopic and the mathematical and the non-teleological. We learned a great deal about the forces of nature, electromagnetism and gravity and so on, about the structure of the atom, the constitution of material substances. However, this process of analyzing and dissecting things into their ultimate constituents reached its ultimate limit with the discovery of the quantum realm approximately 100 years ago. And we're still figuring out what that means. And I think that people don't yet understand, and I'll argue that the quantum revolution actually a great counter-revolution, that everything that the scientific revolution did, the quantum revolution should reverse, ultimately. Now, in one of the great ironies of history, the most effective refutation of the physicalism of modern science comes from physics itself. Quantum physics, as pioneers like Bohr, Planck, and Heisenberg saw, is forcing us back to Aristotle's philosophy, completing a reversal of the scientific revolution. The quantum revolution is a counter-revolution. Here we see this again in three ways. First of all, quantum physics forces us to recognize the Aristotelian distinction between actuality and potentiality. If reductive materialism had been true, we should have found, as we studied smaller and smaller things, the microscopic domain to become more and more definite and exact, But we find the exact opposite. The microscopic world is a domain of amorphous possibilities made definite only at the macroscopic level. Secondly, the phenomena of quantum entanglement demonstrates that particles are not separate and autonomous entities, but derive their powers and dispositions holistically from a wider context. And thirdly, as Max Planck noted, the centrality of a principle of so-called least action in quantum mechanics restores natural teleology to its pride of place in our understanding of the physical world. Now, my collaborator, William Simpson, and I have been working over the last 10 years to bring out more closely the distinction between the connections between quantum mechanics and Aristotelian philosophy. Simpson came out with a book last year called Hylomorphism. Hylomorphism, it's the matter-form theory of Aristotle from Cambridge. And I've got a book from 2022 called Is Thomas Aquinas' Philosophy of Nature Obsolete? They're both actually pretty reasonable books, prices books, so go out get them. In fact, the whole 20th century, so this is the scientific background. Philosophically, the whole 20th century has been characterized by the gradual recovery of Aristotelian insights. There's been a rediscovery of Aristotle's philosophy of nature and philosophy of science, correcting the misconception that it was dogmatic and a priori. In ethics, the revival of virtue ethics and eudaimonism by philosophers such as Elizabeth Anscombe, Alistair MacIntyre just recently died, Philippa Foot, has restored Aristotelian ethics to the mainstream. And the resurrection of metaphysics after the collapse of logical positivism has brought back to life key elements of Aristotle's system, including causal powers and potentialities, essences and real definitions, So the revival of Aristotelian philosophy of nature, here's my finally get to the title. The restoration of Aristotle's philosophy of nature has made possible the revival of Aristotelian natural theology, along the lines developed by Avicenna, Maimonides, and especially for me, Thomas Aquinas. So my colleague at UT Austin, Dan Bonnenbeck, and I have just finished a manuscript on Aquinas' 5 Ways, in which we show that Thomas's arguments for God are not outdated or scientifically obsolete at all, but can be very effectively defended today. And this is precisely because the Aristotelian framework is once again viable. And in fact, it's unavoidable, I think, if I'm right. So it's not surprising that the human soul, natural law, free will, and a classical conception of God form a package deal. If you delete any one of these, the others are no longer sustainable. And once we see that human beings are a part of nature, a special part, but a part nonetheless, a part of a nature created by God, then we can recognize the dignity of the human body and the indispensability of history and community. One of the bad fruits of the scientific revolution was the kind of dualism between the mind and the body, the soul and the body, and the depreciation, therefore, of the value of the human body as such. And the Aristotelian tradition will revive that notion. The teleological structure of human life negates the radical individualism of the modern world. It recognizes that human beings are social and political animals by nature, and that social context transforms us in a fundamental sort of way, especially epistemologically. Now, some conservatives might object that there's a kind of incompatibility between metaphysics and conservatism, and you can find some statements by Kirk and Berg and others, I think, taken out of context to make that sort of case. But the real objection of Burkeans, I think, to the modern project of abstract, a priori, and ahistorical metaphysics it's really an objection to the kind of metaphysics you find in Descartes, Spinoza, and Kant. Aristotelian metaphysics is anything but abstract in that sense. It's concrete, empirical, communal, and respectful of tradition. So if you reject Aristotle, one rejects sound philosophy. If one rejects sound philosophy, one cripples the human mind. That's it. Thanks. Then.